Zaya gazed at the cracked viewport of her aging spacecraft, her hands shaking as she held the console. The stars beyond were stark and indifferent, their cold light reflecting her own despair. Each glimmer of light seemed a silent witness to her spiraling life, a vast, uncaring cosmos that offered neither solace nor solution. Behind her, a soft, curious voice broke the silence. "Mommy, are we almost there?" Lena's small fingers tugged at Zarya's sleeve. Her wide, luminescent eyes filled with both wonder and fatigue. Zaya turned to her daughter, her expression softening despite the storm raging within her. Lena's innocence was a sharp contrast to the desolation Zaya felt. "Soon, my love," she whispered, her voice firm yet gentle. "Earth is just ahead." The journey to this point had been grueling. Zaya's home planet, or Reth, was a place of pristine architecture, technological marvels, and unyielding social rules. Every aspect of life was dictated by rigid tradition. Families were sacred, their unity reflecting one's honor and standing in society. To live outside that system was to exist on the fringes, a life of isolation and disdain. Once, Zaya had lived in the center of that structure, cherished and admired as the wife of Kel, a man whose ambition was as vast as the galaxy itself. He had been charming, daring, and visionary, a rising star in Earth's ranks. Zaya had loved him deeply, their bond seemingly unbreakable. They had talked for hours about their dreams, their plans to explore distant worlds, and the legacy they would leave for their child. But dreams had a way of twisting into nightmares. Kel's ambition consumed him. What began as a quest for knowledge and adventure spiraled into greed. He ventured into dangerous trade routes, dealing with unsavory forces that promised riches and power. Hiza had pleaded with him to stop, to think of Liana, but he was deaf to her words. One day, without warning, he left. At first, Zaya waited, believing he would return, that the man she loved would remember his promises and his family. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The truth sank in slowly like a cold fog creeping over her heart. Kel was not coming back. His absence was not just an emotional wound. It became a societal scar on Earth. Single mothers were viewed as failures. Women who could not maintain their family's unity. They were whispered about in public spaces, their children eyed with disdain or outright shunned. Zaya's once bright life dimmed under the weight of judgment and ostracism. "Mommy!" Lena's voice pulled Zaya back to the present. The child's face was pale, her cheeks hollow from days of meager rations. Zaya bit her lip, guilt and determination warring within her. She knelt, brushing a stray strand of golden hair from Lena's face. "You're so brave, my little star," she murmured, pressing a kiss to Lena's forehead. "Just a little longer." The ship's systems groaned, a harsh reminder of its deteriorating state. Zaya glanced at the navigation panel. Earth's atmosphere was close, its blue and green hues vivid against the void. A sliver of hope pierced her despair. This planet, according to the scant information she had managed to gather, was said to be home to a compassionate species. Humans, they were called. Perhaps they would offer what Earth had refused, a chance for her and Lena to rebuild their lives. The descent was chaotic. Alarms blared as the ship's aging system struggled to handle atmospheric entry. Zaya gritted her teeth, her hands dancing over the controls as she fought to keep the craft stable. Lena clung to her arm, her small body trembling. "It's okay, Lena. I've got you," Zaya said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. The ship shuddered violently, a deafening crack splitting through the cabin as a panel burst into sparks. Smoke filled the air, stinging Zaya's eyes. She activated the emergency landing protocols, praying the ship wouldn't disintegrate before they touched down. Finally, with a bone-jarring crash, the spacecraft skidded to a halt. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Zaya sat frozen for a moment, her ears ringing and her heart pounding. "Mommy!" Lena's small voice broke the stillness. Zaya unbuckled herself, stumbling over to her daughter, shaken. She examined Lena for injuries, her hands shaking. "Are you hurt?" Lena shook her head, her eyes wide but calm. "I'm okay. Relief washed over Zaya as she pulled Lena into a fierce hug. "Good girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The planet's surface was a stark contrast to Earth's sleek, glowing cities. Earth's landscape was raw and unpolished. Trees swayed in the stormy wind, their branches clawing at the dark sky. Rain poured in sheets, soaking Zaria as she carried Lena out of the wreckage. She scouted the area quickly, her eyes scanning for threats. The environment was unfamiliar, its scents and sounds alien to her. But there was no time to dwell on her unease. Lena needed shelter. Using pieces of the ship's debris, Zaka constructed a crude lean-to beneath the shadow of a large oak tree. The rain dripped through cracks, but it offered some protection from the relentless downpour. Zaya wrapped Lena in a blanket, sitting close to shield her from the cold as the storm raged around them. Zaya's mind churned with worry. She had no resources, no allies, and no idea how the inhabitants of this planet would react to her presence. But as she gazed at Lena's peaceful face, her resolve hardened. She had not come this far to fail now. For hours, Zala kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for signs of danger. The storm began to subside, the rain softening to a steady patter. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she refused to sleep. She couldn't risk it. Just as dawn began to break, painting the sky with pale streaks of gold, Zasa's ears caught a sound of rustling in the nearby brush. Her heart leaped into her throat. She tightened her grip on a jagged piece of metal she had salvaged from the ship, ready to defend her daughter at any cost. A figure emerged from the mist, tall and broad-shouldered, with cautious movements that spoke of both curiosity and weariness. Zaya's breath hitched. This was no creature of Earth. It was a human. For the first time since leaving Earth, Zaya felt the delicate stirrings of hope and fear. Ethan trudged through the muddy field, his boots sinking with each step. The storm had turned his usually tranquil farm into a mire of chaos. Fences had collapsed under the weight of the wind, and a few loose tools lay scattered across the sodden ground. He muttered a quiet curse under his breath, pulling his coat tighter against the rain that still drizzled from the gray sky. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a simple check of the property line before turning in for the night. But the faint glow in the distance had caught his eye. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the storm, maybe a stray bolt of lightning. Yet the light didn't flicker or fade. It pulsed steady and faint like a beacon. Curiosity tugged at him, and despite his exhaustion, Ethan followed the light. Zaya tightened her grip on the jagged metal shard, her eyes fixed on the figure approaching through the mist. Her muscles were taut, ready to spring into action if this human, this towering, broad-shouldered being, posed a threat. The man stopped several feet away, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He stood still for a moment, as if assessing the situation, then slowly raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hey there," he said, his voice deep and cautious, but devoid of hostility. Zaya didn't lower her makeshift weapon. The language he spoke was strange but familiar, something she had studied in preparation for her journey to Earth. The words felt clumsy in her mouth, but she forced herself to respond. "Stay back," she said, her voice sharp despite the trembling in her hands. The man nodded, taking a deliberate step back. "All right, no harm meant." His gaze flicked to the small figure curled against her. Lena peeked out from under the blanket, her luminous eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion, but there was no mistaking the concern that flickered across his face. "You two look like you've been through a lot," he said after a moment. "You're soaked to the bone. Got a warm house just a little ways up, food, dry clothes. You can rest there if you want." Zaya hesitated. The offer sounded genuine, but her trust had been shattered too many times to accept kindness without question. She glanced at Lena, whose small frame shivered despite the blanket wrapped around her. The decision wasn't about her. It was about Lena. Always Lena. "Fine," she said finally, her tone clipped. "But if you try anything, I won't." Ethan interrupted gently. "You have my word." Ethan led them back to his farmhouse, his steps careful as he navigated the uneven ground. Zaya kept close behind him, her grip on the metal shard never loosening. Lena clung to her mother's side, her small feet slipping in the mud as they walked. When the farmhouse came into view, Zaya's sharp gaze took in every detail. It was a modest structure, its wooden exterior weathered but sturdy. A soft yellow light glowed from the windows, casting a welcoming aura against the dreary landscape. Ethan pushed open the door and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter first. Zaya hesitated, scanning the interior before stepping cautiously over the threshold. The warmth of the room enveloped her, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. The space was simple, yet inviting. A stone fireplace crackled in one corner, its warmth seeping into the air. A worn but comfortable-looking couch sat near the hearth, and a wooden table occupied the center of the room. The scent of earth and pine lingered faintly, mixed with the aroma of bread cooling on the counter. "You can sit," Ethan said, nodding toward the couch. "I'll get some towels." Reza didn't move. Instead, she watched him closely as he disappeared into another room, her instincts on high alert. Lena, however, wandered toward the couch, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. "Mommy, it's warm here," Lena whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Zaya's chest tightened. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Stay close to me," she murmured. "Always close." Ethan returned moments later, a pair of towels draped over his arm. He handed one to Zaya and placed the other on the couch for Lena. "Fire's warm. You're welcome to dry off," he said, stepping back to give them space. Zaya accepted the towel but didn't let her guard down. She dried Lena first, wrapping her daughter tightly in the dry cloth before tending to herself. Her movements were quick, efficient, every motion driven by the instinct to protect and provide. As the evening wore on, Ethan busied himself in the kitchen, giving Zaya and Lena time to acclimate. He moved with a quiet purpose, gathering supplies and setting a pot on the stove. Zaya watched him from her seat by the fire, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement. "Soup will be ready in a bit," he said over his shoulder. "Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up." Zaya didn't respond. Her mistrust lingered, but there was something about this man, his deliberate movements, his calm demeanor, that set him apart from the others she had encountered in her life. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't press for answers. Instead, he simply provided. Lena, ever curious, broke the silence. "What soup?" Ethan turned, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's food. Warm food. You'll like it." Zaya frowned. "She doesn't eat your food." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. "Fair enough. If she gets hungry, let me know. I'll see what I can do later." As Lena dozed on the couch, wrapped snugly in blankets, Ethan brought Zaya a steaming bowl of soup. She eyed it wearily before accepting, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bowl. "You don't have to tell me anything," Ethan said, sitting across from her. "Not where you're from. Not why you're here. But I figure you've been through a lot. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome here." Zaya stared at him, the words catching her off guard. His eyes were steady, his tone sincere. She had heard offers of help before, but they always came with strings attached. Expectations, demands, betrayals. Yet this man's demeanor was different. There was no agenda in his gaze, only quiet compassion. For a moment, Zaya considered telling him the truth. The crash, her flight from Earth, her desperation to protect Lena. But fear held her back. Instead, she nodded curtly. "Thank you." He didn't press further. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and rose to stoke the fire. As the night deepened, Zaya found herself watching Ethan, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded exterior. There was a weight in his movements, a heaviness that spoke of loss. She recognized it, had lived it. But whatever this man had endured, it had carved deep lines into his soul, lines she could almost see etched across his face. For the first time since Kel's betrayal, Zamia felt a sliver of safety. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close, and for now, that was enough. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world silent and still. Inside, beneath the warm glow of the fire, two strangers sat quietly, each unknowingly beginning a journey that would change their lives. As morning broke slowly over the farm, the pale light of dawn creeping through the mist, Zaya awoke with a start. Her body instinctively tensed as her mind snapped to awareness. She was still on edge, her instincts honed from years of surviving in a hostile world. The small room was unfamiliar, the warmth from the fireplace a stark contrast to the harsh conditions she and Lena had endured in recent weeks. For a moment she didn't recognize the muted sounds of earth, the chirping birds, the creak of wooden beams in the farmhouse, the distant low of cattle. And then she saw Lena. Her daughter was still curled up on the couch, her small body cocooned in a blanket Ethan had provided. Lena's breathing was soft and even, her face relaxed in a way Zaya hadn't seen in months. It was a sight that simultaneously warmed and shattered Zaya's heart. Lena shouldn't have had to endure this life, their life. But here she was, adapting in a way that only children could. The sound of clinking dishes drew Zaya's attention to the kitchen. She stiffened, her hand instinctively searching for the jagged metal shard she had kept close during the night. It was still there, tucked into the folds of her makeshift belt. Quietly, she rose, padding toward the sound on silent feet. Ethan stood at the counter, his back to her. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up, exposing forearms marked with faded scars, remnants of a life that hinted at labor and hardship. He moved with quiet efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl and stirring them with a fork. The soft hiss of a pan heating on the stove filled the silence. Fariza lingered in the doorway, her sharp gaze assessing every detail. The kitchen was small but well kept, its surfaces worn from years of use but clean. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, their earthy scent mixing with the aroma of coffee brewing on the counter. "You're up early," Ethan said without turning, his voice breaking the stillness. He wasn't looking at her, but there was no mistaking the awareness in his tone. "Didn't think I'd hear you over the floorboards." Zaya straightened, stepping into the room with measured caution. "I couldn't sleep." Ethan glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression neutral. "I get that. There's coffee if you want some. Eggs will be ready soon." Zaya didn't respond. She crossed her arms, her gaze flicking to the window. The fields outside were blanketed in mist, the rising sun casting a soft glow over the horizon. It was eerily peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of her recent life. Ethan turned back to his work, seeming unbothered by her silence. His case. He cooked with the same quiet competence that had marked his actions the night before, as though used to doing everything alone. The realization pricked at Zaya's curiosity, though she quickly pushed the thought aside. "Your daughter's still asleep?" he asked after a moment. "Yes," Zaya replied, her tone clipped. She wasn't ready to share more. Ethan didn't press further. He plated the eggs and set them on the table along with a loaf of fresh bread. "Help yourself," he said simply, pouring a cup of coffee and sitting down at the table. He didn't eat, just sipped his coffee and gazed out the window. Lena's soft footsteps broke the silence as she appeared in the doorway, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her wide eyes flicked between Zafia and Ethan, hesitant but curious. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice softer than before. "You hungry?" Lena hesitated, glancing at her mother for permission. "Zagay." Shkriza gave a small nod, and Lena approached the table, her movements cautious, but no longer fearful. Ethan cut a slice of bread and placed it on a plate, pushing it toward her. Lena took it with both hands, her small fingers gripping the edges as though it might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're welcome." Over the next few days, a tentative routine began to take shape. Ethan provided food and shelter without asking for anything in return, and Zaya allowed herself to cautiously lower her defenses, though only slightly. She spent her days helping Lena adjust to their new environment, teaching her the names of Earth's creatures and marveling at the simple beauty of things they had never encountered before. The vibrant green of grass, the warmth of sunlight unfiltered by the harsh metallic skyline of Orth, the way rain felt soft and cool rather than biting and cold. Ethan stayed busy with his work, tending to the fields and repairing the damage from the storm. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, giving Zala and Lena the space they clearly needed. Yet his quiet presence was a constant, and Zala found herself observing him more than she cared to admit. There was a weight to Ethan, a heaviness in his movements, a quiet sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. It wasn't pity, though. It was understanding, the kind that only came from surviving something that left you broken and rebuilding yourself piece by piece. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Zakia found herself sitting on the porch steps. Lena was inside, fast asleep, after a day spent chasing butterflies in the field. The air was cool, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. Ethan joined her, sitting a respectful distance away, holding a mug of coffee in his hands, the steam curling into the fading light. "You've been quiet," he said after a long pause. Zaya glanced at him, her expression guarded. "I don't have much to say." "That's fair," he replied. "But sometimes saying it out loud helps." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of her past pressed heavily on her chest, a burden she had carried alone for so long. But something about Ethan's calm, unassuming presence made her want to let go just a little. "My husband left us," she said finally, her voice flat. "Abandoned us. Where I come from, that's worse than death." Ethan didn't interrupt, his eyes steady as he listened. "I had to leave," Zaya continued, her tone softening. "Not for me, but for Lena. She deserves better than what our world offered." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Sounds like you've done everything you can to protect her." Zaya looked at him then, surprised by the lack of judgment in his voice. "I have," she said, her voice firm. "And I'll keep doing it no matter what." Ethan's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I believe you." The silence that followed was different. Less heavy, more understanding. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zaya felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Inside the farmhouse, Lena stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Eza rose to check on her, pausing at the door to glance back at Ethan. He was still sitting on the steps, staring out at the darkening fields, his shoulders relaxed, his expression peaceful. For the first time, Zaya wondered if this place, this quiet farm on a strange distant world, could truly be a home. The days stretched into weeks, and a fragile sense of routine began to settle over the farmhouse. Zaya found herself slowly easing into this life, though a part of her remained on edge. It was too simple, too peaceful. Life had taught her that such serenity was often fleeting. For Lena, the farm was a wonderland. Each day brought new discoveries of fluttering butterflies, the soft bristle of grass beneath her feet, the curious antics of the chickens that Ethan kept in a small coop. Leza watched her daughter thrive in this new world, her laughter ringing out as she dashed across the fields. It was a sound Zahia hadn't heard in what felt like years, filling her heart with both joy and dread. But Zahia couldn't shake the shadow of her past. The scars left by her husband's betrayal and her society's judgment clung to her like a second skin. Even here, in the safety of Ethan's home, she couldn't banish the fear that it could all be ripped away. Ethan, as always, was a quiet presence. He rose before dawn, tending to the farm with practiced efficiency. Zaya often joined him, helping in small ways, mending fences, collecting eggs, or simply keeping Lena occupied while he worked. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Yet even as their bond deepened, Zaya remained wary. She caught herself analyzing Ethan's every action, searching for ulterior motives that never seemed to exist. He was kind without being overbearing, generous without expecting anything in return. It baffled her. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the vegetable garden, Zaya finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why are you helping us?" Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Zaya frowned, the answer too straightforward for her liking. People don't just do things out of kindness, not without wanting something in return. Ethan leaned against his shovel, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's been your experience," he said after a moment, "but not everyone's like that." The words struck a chord, but Zaya didn't respond. She turned back to her work, her thoughts churning. That night, as the farmhouse settled into quiet, Zaya sat by the fire, her mind restless. Lena had fallen asleep hours ago, her small body curled up in a nest of blankets. Ethan was in his room, the creak of floorboards signaling his movements as he prepared for bed. Zaya stared into the flames, their flickering light casting shadows on the walls. She couldn't stay here forever, she told herself. This was temporary, a refuge, not a home. But the thought of leaving filled her with a cold dread. Where would they go? How would she keep Lena safe? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the floorboards behind her. She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression cautious but kind. "Can't sleep?" he asked, stepping into the room. Zaya shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Ethan sat down in the chair across from her, cradling a mug of tea in his hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of wind outside. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Ethan said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "You and Lena can stay as long as you need." As Jaya's chest tightened. "And what happens when you change your mind?" she asked, her voice sharp. "When you decide we're too much trouble?" Ethan's brow furrowed, his gaze steady. "I won't." "How can you be so sure?" she demanded, her voice rising. "People always leave. Always." But Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe most people do. But I'm not most people." Zaya stared at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his eyes, Sharian honesty, that unnerved her. It wasn't pity or obligation. It was something deeper, something she wasn't sure she could trust. "I can't lose her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's all I have." "You won't," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Not while you're here." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time in years, Zaya felt the faint stirrings of trust. It was fragile, like a fledgling taking its first steps. But it was there. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Ethan taught Zaya the rhythms of the farm, how to tend to the animals, when to plant and harvest the crops, the intricacies of maintaining the machinery that kept everything running. Zaya found herself enjoying the work, the physical effort grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. Lena, too, thrived in this environment, following Ethan around like a shadow, her endless questions bringing a rare smile to his face. Maiza watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and fear. She wanted to believe this could last, but the fear of losing it was ever present. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Zaya finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I can't keep depending on you," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not fair." Ethan glanced at her, his expression calm. "You're not a burden if that's what you're thinking." "But I am," she said, her voice firm. And I can't live like this, wondering when it's all going to fall apart." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "What do you want, Zaya?" The question caught her off guard. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "I want Lena to be safe. I want her to have a future." "And what about you?" Ethan pressed. "What do you want for yourself?" Zaya hesitated, the question striking a nerve. She had spent so long focusing on Lena's needs that she hadn't allowed herself to consider her own desires. What did she want? Safety? Yes, stability. But more than that, she realized she wanted a place to belong. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his expression understanding. "Well, maybe that's something we can figure out together." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Zamia's chest ache. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that this life, this man, could be the beginning of something more. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the horizon. Olza stood on the farmhouse porch, watching as the sun broke through the clouds, its golden light spilling across the landscape. In the distance, Lena's laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Ethan was nearby, repairing the fence that bordered the field, his steady movements a reassuring constant. For a moment, Zaya allowed herself to breathe deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Peace. It felt fragile, like a glass too thin to hold its shape. But it was there. She wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of the decision she had made the night before still heavy on her mind. The evening prior had been a turning point. After weeks of wrestling with her fears, Zaya had finally allowed herself to confront them. She had waited until Lena was asleep, her small body tucked under a quilt Ethan had given her. Then, With a resolve born from desperation and hope, Zaya had approached Ethan. He had been sitting by the fire, a book resting in his lap. The room was quiet, the only sound, the soft crackle of the flames. Zaya had stood in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "I need to talk to you," she had said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Ethan had looked up, his expression open and calm. "All right." She had stepped into the room, her movements deliberate, and sat down across from him. For a moment she couldn't find the words. They tangled in her throat, threatening to choke her. But she forced herself to speak. "I don't want to leave," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stay like this, uncertain, waiting for the day it all falls apart." Ethan had set his book aside, leaning forward slightly. "What are you saying?" Zaya had taken a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his. "I'm saying I want more than shelter. I want stability. A home, a family." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with vulnerability. Zaya had braced herself for rejection, for disbelief. But what she had seen in Ethan's eyes had startled her. It wasn't pity or hesitation, it was understanding. "You're serious," he had said, his tone quiet but firm. "Yes," she had replied. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know this isn't what you signed up for. But I can't keep living in fear. And Lena deserves more than a mother who's always looking over her shoulder." Ethan had been silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then he had nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right." Zaya had blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "All right. I've been thinking about this for a while," he had admitted. "About you. About Lena. You've brought something back into this house I thought I'd lost forever. I wasn't sure if I could handle it, letting someone in again. But I want to try." His words had broken something in Zaya, the walls she had spent years building cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She had looked away, blinking back tears, and nodded. "Okay." Now, as she stood on the porch watching Lena play in the morning light, Zaya felt the first stirrings of hope. It wasn't a dramatic shift. Her fears hadn't disappeared overnight. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. The transition wasn't seamless. Building a life together required patience and compromise. Zaya and Ethan learned to navigate their differences, her sharp edges against his quiet steadiness, as they found common ground in their shared determination to give Lena a stable, happy life. Lena, for her part, flourished in this new dynamic, adoring Ethan, following him around the farm, and peppering him with endless questions. He answered each one with patience, his gruff exterior softening in her presence. Zaya. Keza watched their bond grow with a mixture of gratitude and awe, her heart aching with the knowledge that Ethan had become the father Lena had never known. The challenges they faced were not insignificant. There were practical matters to address. Introducing Zaya and Lena to the few neighbors who occasionally stopped by, explaining their presence without revealing too much. Ethan handled it with characteristic calm, weaving a story about distant relatives in need of help. It wasn't entirely a lie, he told Zara later. In his eyes, they had become family. There were also moments of tension, particularly when Zaralea's past threatened to intrude on their new life. She had nightmares, vivid, haunting dreams of Kel's betrayal and the judgmental stares of her people. Ethan learned to recognize the signs, sitting with her in silence, until the worst of it passed. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the stars spread like a tapestry above them. Zaya turned to Ethan. "Do you think they'll ever come for us?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Sure." "Your people?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. She nodded. "If they find out where we are, I don't know what they'll do." Ethan's expression hardened, his gaze steady. "If they come, we'll deal with it together." The simplicity of his answer calmed her in a way she couldn't explain. She nodded, her fingers brushing against his as they rested on the wooden armrest. The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth through her that lingered long after. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The farm flourished under their combined efforts, and the house, once quiet and lonely, became a place of laughter and life. Ethan taught Zaya how to ride the old tractor, her initial frustration giving way to laughter as she navigated the uneven terrain. Zaya, in turn, shared stories of Orth with Lena and Ethan, her voice weaving a tapestry of a world both beautiful and flawed. The three of them found a rhythm, their lives intertwining in ways none of them had expected. They were still learning, still growing, but for the first time they felt like a family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Naira stood in the field watching Lena and Ethan chase each other through the tall grass. Lena's laughter echoed across the farm, and Ethan's rare smile lit up his face. Naira felt her chest tighten, the weight of her fears and doubts momentarily lifting. She had spent so long running, so long protecting herself and Lena from a world that had turned its back on them. But here, in this quiet corner of a distant planet, she had found something she hadn't dared to hope for: a place to belong. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Naira joined them in the field, her heart full and her steps light. Together, they faced the unknown, no longer alone, but as a family bound by love, resilience, and the promise of a future worth fighting for.